You're crouched in the dark, 30 feet from the fire, and your hands won't stop shaking. Someone in your group just did something everyone agreed was forbidden. And in about 60 seconds, 40 people are going to decide whether that person lives or dies. There's no judge, no courtroom, no written law, just firelight, whispers, and a decision that could end a life before sunrise. This isn't a scene from a movie. This is Tuesday 40,000 years ago. And the terrifying part? The system that's about to play out in front of you is the same system running underneath every argument you've had this year. Because here's the question nobody talks about. Humans didn't invent laws because we're civilized. We invented laws because we're violent, jealous, food-obsessed animals who figured out that without rules, we'd tear each other apart within a generation. And the evidence for how that happened is stranger, bloodier, and more uncomfortable than anything you learned in school. Let's go back to the beginning. Not to Rome, not to Babylon. Back to a time before writing, before cities, before anyone had ever said the word justice out loud. Back to when the biggest threat to your survival wasn't a lion. It was the guy sleeping 6 feet away from you. Picture your world. You live in a band of maybe 25 to 50 people. You know every single one of them. You've shared meat with them. You've buried their children with them. There is no police station. There is no jail. There is no appeals process. If something goes wrong between two people, there is nothing standing between an insult and a spear through someone's chest. And things went wrong constantly. Anthropologists who've studied surviving hunter-gatherer societies, the Jew/Hoansi of the Kalahari, the Hadza of Tanzania, found something that should terrify you. Murder rates in small-scale societies without formal law were, per capita, some of the highest ever recorded in human history. Higher than modern Chicago. Higher than wartime cities. Not because ancient humans were more evil. Because there was nothing stopping the spiral once it started. Here's how it worked, and here's why it should sound painfully familiar. Someone steals food. The person they stole from gets angry. Words are exchanged. Someone throws a punch or worse, a spear. Now the victim's family wants revenge. They kill the original thief. Now the thief's family wants revenge for that. This is called a blood feud, and once it starts, it doesn't stop on its own. It only stops when one side is wiped out, or when the whole group agrees to intervene before it gets that far. That intervention, that agreement, is the first law humans ever created. Not written, not spoken as a formal decree, just a shared, desperate understanding. If we don't figure out a way to stop this before it starts, we're all going to die. But here's what scientists actually found when they dug deeper into this. The earliest human rules weren't really about morality at all. They were about math. Cold, brutal survival math. A band of 40 people cannot survive a blood feud that kills off 10 of them. So rules didn't emerge because humans suddenly grew a conscience. They emerged because groups that couldn't control internal violence went extinct, and groups that could, didn't. Think about that for a second. Every single person alive today is descended from the ancestors who figured out how to stop killing each other over insults. The ones who couldn't figure it out, their lineages ended. You are, quite literally, the biological result of a filtering system built on conflict resolution. Now here's the part that reframes everything you think you know about ancient justice. You'd assume the punishment for breaking a rule was violence. A beating, an execution, something physical and immediate. Sometimes it was. But researchers studying forager societies found something far more common and far more psychologically brutal: ostracism. Not death. Silence. If you broke a rule in a hunter-gatherer band, the group's first move usually wasn't to attack you. It was to stop talking to you, to stop sharing food with you, to stop looking at you when you spoke. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm, who spent decades studying this exact behavior, called it one of the most powerful control mechanisms early humans ever developed. And here's the twist. It worked better than violence because violence created enemies who might kill you back. Silence created shame. And shame, it turns out, is a weapon humans have been using on each other since before we could write our own names. Ask yourself something uncomfortable right now. Have you ever been in a group chat where someone got quietly frozen out? Left on read by everyone at once? Excluded from plans without a single word said? That's not a modern social media phenomenon. That's 40,000-year-old software running on new hardware. Neuroscientists have actually measured this. Studies using brain imaging found that social exclusion activates the same regions of the brain as physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex lights up whether you've been punched or ignored. Your brain, at a neurological level, cannot fully distinguish between "I got hit" and "I got ghosted," which means the punishment ancient humans invented for breaking the rules is one your body is still afraid of today. But ostracism alone wasn't enough to build a functioning society. Because ostracism only works on people who care about belonging. What about the ones who don't? What about the person who breaks the rules over and over, who takes more than their share, who threatens the group again and again? For those people, early humans developed something far darker. And this is where it stops being about hurt feelings and starts being about survival. Boehm's research on forager societies revealed a pattern that shows up again and again across completely unrelated cultures on different continents. A pattern too consistent to be coincidence. When a member of the group became too dangerous, too dominant, too much of a threat to everyone else's safety, the group didn't wait for a single hero to stop them. They didn't have a strongman step in and kill the bully. Instead, multiple people, sometimes the entire group, would coordinate quietly and eliminate the threat together. This is called coalition enforcement, and it might be the single most important invention in the entire history of human law. Because a lone tyrant, even a strong one, cannot fight off an entire group acting in coordination. This is the moment humans figured out something that every legal system since has been built on. Power isn't controlled by one strong person overpowering another. Power is controlled by the group agreeing together that no single person gets to have too much of it. Here's where it gets genuinely disturbing. Some anthropological accounts of small-scale societies describe cases where a violent, dominant male, someone repeatedly abusing others, hoarding resources, or committing murder, was killed not by one enraged victim, but by a planned, collective execution involving several men acting as a unit. Quiet, deliberate, agreed upon in advance. Not a fight, an execution. Let that sit for a second. Long before courts, before juries, before the word trial existed, humans were already holding secret deliberations about whether someone deserved to die, and then carrying it out together so no single person bore the guilt alone. Sound familiar? It should. Because that same structure, a group agreeing together on a punishment so responsibility is shared and no individual bears full moral weight, is the exact psychological engine behind the modern jury system. 12 people. One verdict. No single juror has to carry the full weight of deciding a person's fate alone. That comfort, that diffusion of responsibility, is not a courtroom invention. It's a survival strategy that's been running in human groups for tens of thousands of years. What you're about to hear next was buried for a long time, because it complicates the tidy story people like to tell about how civilization improved on primitive chaos. The truth is messier, and a lot more uncomfortable. As bands grew into larger groups, tribes, then chiefdoms, then the first proto-states, something happened that most people assume was progress. Rules stopped being something the whole group enforced together, and started being something one person or one small group of people controlled. This is the birth of authority. And it is also, if you look closely, the birth of the first real inequality humans ever built on purpose. Here's the uncomfortable part scientists have pieced together from archaeological and anthropological evidence. In small foraging bands, leaders had almost no real power. If a big man tried to boss people around too much, the group would simply stop listening to him, mock him, or, in extreme cases, remove him the same way they removed any other dangerous person. Egalitarianism wasn't a nice ideal ancient humans held. It was enforced, aggressively, by the threat of collective punishment against anyone who tried to dominate the group. But once populations grew larger, once farming created surplus food that could be stored, hoarded, and controlled, something changed. It became possible, for the first time in human history, for one person to control resources that hundreds of other people depended on. And once that happened, the balance of power flipped. The group could no longer easily gang up on the person in charge, because the person in charge now controlled the food. This is the moment law stopped being a shared agreement between equals and started becoming something imposed from above. And once that shift happened, it never fully reversed. You feel this shift every single day. whether you realize it or not. Every time you follow a rule not because you agree with it, but because you're afraid of what happens if you don't, a fine, a firing, an arrest, you're living inside the exact same structural shift that happened thousands of years ago when a chief first realized he could control people through control of resources rather than through mutual agreement. But here's what scientists actually found when they looked at the earliest written law codes, and it will change how you think about the entire concept of ancient justice. You've probably heard of the Code of Hammurabi, carved into a massive stone pillar in Babylon, nearly 4,000 years ago. An eye for an eye. People love to quote it as if it were some primitive, brutal relic we've thankfully evolved past. Except that's not really what it was for. Hammurabi's code wasn't written to encourage revenge. It was written to limit it. Before codified law, if someone took your eye, you might respond by killing their entire family. The written law said, no. If someone takes your eye, the punishment is exactly one eye. Not a massacre. Not a blood feud spanning 3 generations. One eye for one eye, and then it's over. The earliest written laws in human history weren't about escalating punishment. They were about capping it, ending the endless cycles of revenge that had been tearing small-scale societies apart for tens of thousands of years. This is the first time in human history that punishment was standardized, written down, and made predictable. And predictability, it turns out, might be the single most underrated ingredient in what makes a society survive long-term. Think about it from a psychological angle for a second. Uncertainty is one of the most stressful states a human brain can experience. Studies on stress and decision-making consistently show that unpredictable punishment, not knowing what will happen to you, or when, creates dramatically more anxiety than predictable punishment, even when the predictable punishment is more severe. A written law, however harsh, removed one of the most destabilizing forces in human social life. Not knowing what would happen if you broke a rule. This connects to something running through your own life right now, whether you've noticed it or not. You probably follow rules at your job you don't fully agree with. But you follow them anyway, because you know exactly what happens if you don't. That certainty, not fear of chaos but knowledge of consequence, is psychologically easier for your brain to live with than not knowing at all. Ancient humans figured this out with stone tablets. You're living the exact same principle through an employee handbook. Here's a question that should make you slightly uneasy. If the earliest laws were designed to control revenge and violence between equals, why do so many of the oldest legal codes also include incredibly detailed rules about property, marriage, debt, and inheritance? Why does Hammurabi's code spend so much time on who owes what to whom? Because somewhere in the transition from small bands to large agricultural societies, humans invented something almost as dangerous as violence itself, debt. And debt, it turns out, might be one of the most underrated forces in the entire history of human law. Anthropologist David Graeber's research into the origins of debt found something that upends the standard economics textbook story you were probably taught. You were likely told that money was invented to replace clumsy barter systems. I have chickens, you have shoes, we need a universal medium of exchange. But there is almost no historical evidence that large-scale barter economies ever actually existed the way textbooks describe. What existed instead long before money was debt. You give me food today because I'm starving. I owe you. Someday, when you're in need, I'll help you. This wasn't written down. It didn't need to be in a small group where everyone knew everyone. But debt built on memory and trust works fine at 50 people. It falls apart completely at 5,000. Once societies grew too large for everyone to remember who owed what to whom, they needed something else. They needed a way to formalize obligation, to make debt visible, trackable, and enforceable, even between strangers who'd never met before and might never meet again. That is one of the primary reasons humans developed writing, currency, and formal legal codes in the first place. Not to describe philosophy, not to record poetry, to keep track of who owed what, and what happened to you if you didn't pay. And what happened if you didn't pay was often horrifying. In multiple ancient legal systems, unpaid debt could result in debt slavery. You, your spouse, or your children could legally become the property of the person you owed, sometimes for years, sometimes permanently. This wasn't a footnote in ancient law. In many early legal codes, it was one of the central concerns, because uncontrolled debt was just as dangerous to social stability as uncontrolled violence. Here's the moment that should genuinely unsettle you. Some of the very first recorded law reforms in human history, codes issued by rulers in ancient Mesopotamia, weren't about punishing crime at all. They were debt amnesties. Rulers would periodically cancel all outstanding debts across the entire kingdom, freeing debt slaves and resetting the balance to zero. Why would a ruler willingly cancel debts owed to wealthy creditors? Because they'd learned, the hard way, that a society where debt accumulates without limit doesn't stay stable. It doesn't just create poverty. It creates such extreme resentment, such a widening gap between the people who own everything and the people who owe everything, that eventually the entire system collapses into revolt. The earliest debt forgiveness laws in human history weren't acts of kindness. They were acts of self-preservation by rulers terrified of what happens when inequality goes unchecked for too long. Sit with that for a second because it connects to something you've almost certainly felt in your own life. That creeping, quiet resentment when you feel like the system is rigged. Like some people never have to follow the same rules everyone else does. That feeling has a name in psychology. It's tied to something researchers call inequity aversion. Studies have shown this reaction isn't uniquely human. Even Capuchin monkeys will refuse a reward they'd normally accept if they watch another monkey get a better reward for doing the same task. The rage you feel at unfairness isn't a modern invention. It's an ancient survival alarm, wired into primate brains for millions of years, screaming that unchecked inequality is dangerous to the group. Now here's the midpoint reset, because everything you think you understand about ancient law is about to get more complicated. What you're about to hear was deliberately left out of most textbook versions of this story, because it doesn't fit the narrative of steady human progress from savagery to civilization. The truth is that early written law wasn't just a step forward. In some very specific, very disturbing ways, it was a step backward for a huge number of people. Remember the egalitarian foraging bans, where no single person could dominate the group without the risk of collective punishment. Once law became written, and once it became controlled by kings, priests, and ruling classes, something happened that had never really been possible before. The rules stopped applying equally. In many of the earliest legal codes, punishments explicitly differed based on your social class. If a nobleman injured a commoner, the penalty might be a fine. If a commoner injured a nobleman, the penalty could be death. The same crime, wildly different consequences, based entirely on who you were born as. This wasn't a bug in the system. It was written directly into the law on purpose by the people who benefited from it. This should genuinely bother you, because it means the invention of formal law didn't just create order out of chaos. It also created the first legally protected class system in human history. A system where inequality wasn't just tolerated, it was officially sanctioned, stamped, and enforced by the very institution that was supposed to prevent people from exploiting each other. And here's the part that connects directly to modern life, whether you want it to or not. Every time you felt like the legal system treats wealthy or powerful people differently than everyone else, different consequences for the same offense, you're not imagining a new phenomenon. You're watching the oldest flaw in written law replay itself, 4,000 years later, in a slightly different costume. But let's rewind again, because there's another layer to this story that rarely gets told, and it involves something you might not expect: religion. As human societies grew larger, past the point where any single leader, any single enforcement group, or any single set of written laws could realistically monitor everyone's behavior, humans faced a new problem. How do you make someone follow a rule when no one is watching? The answer many independent cultures arrived at, separately across completely different continents, was terrifyingly effective. Convince people that someone is always watching, even when no human is. Researchers studying the psychology of religion have found something remarkable: belief in a moralizing, punishing God, a deity who actively watches your behavior and punishes wrongdoing, even in secret, appears to have co-evolved alongside the growth of large, complex societies. Smaller societies, where everyone genuinely could keep an eye on everyone else, were far less likely to develop these kinds of surveillance-style gods. It was the large societies, the ones where cheating could go unnoticed, that needed a supernatural enforcement mechanism to fill the gap. Think about what that actually means. Somewhere in human history, groups figured out that fear of an invisible, all-seeing punisher was one of the most cost-effective law enforcement tools ever invented. No police force required. No courts. No prisons. Just the psychological terror of believing that even your most private, secret actions were being recorded by something that could never be fooled. This is why so many ancient legal codes and religious codes are almost indistinguishable from each other. The 10 Commandments aren't just moral guidance. They're law. Theft, murder, and false testimony sit right next to religious instructions, because in the ancient world, there often wasn't a meaningful separation between sin and crime. Breaking a rule wasn't just antisocial. It was cosmic. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever hesitated to do something wrong, even when you were completely certain no one would ever find out? That hesitation, that flicker of what if someone's watching, might be one of the oldest pieces of psychological software humans ever installed in themselves. You didn't invent your conscience from scratch. You inherited a surveillance system your ancestors built to survive in groups too large to monitor with their own eyes. Now here's where the story gets genuinely dark, because we're approaching the part that was buried the deepest, the part most explainer videos skip entirely because it's uncomfortable to say out loud. Early law wasn't just used to punish murder, theft, and violence. In society after society, one of the most severely punished categories of crime had nothing to do with harming another person's body or property at all. It had to do with defying the social order itself. Witchcraft accusations, blasphemy, insulting a ruler, refusing to follow religious rituals. In many ancient and early legal systems, these so-called crimes carried punishments just as severe, sometimes more severe than actual violence. Why would a society punish wrong belief as harshly as murder? Because the people writing the laws understood something deeply cynical about human psychology. Control over what people believe is even more powerful than control over what people do. A person who's punished for stealing learns not to steal. But a person who's punished for questioning the ruling order learns not to question anything at all. And a population that doesn't question anything is a population that's almost impossible to overthrow. This is the darkest function early law served, one that rarely gets mentioned in the tidy version of this story. Law wasn't purely a tool for protecting people from each other. In the hands of the powerful, it became a tool for protecting power itself from the people. The line between keeping order and controlling minds blurred almost from the very beginning, and in many ancient societies it barely existed at all. And here's the final, most disturbing piece of evidence, the one that should genuinely stay with you after this video ends. Archaeological and anthropological evidence from multiple ancient and small-scale societies shows a consistent, chilling pattern. The punishment for the worst offenses, the ones that threatened the group's survival or its power structure most directly, was almost never quick. It was designed to be slow, public, and unforgettable. Public execution, prolonged exile into terrain that made survival almost impossible. Ritualized humiliation performed in front of the entire community. These weren't just about punishing the individual. They were about burning a memory into the mind of every single witness. A silent, brutal message. This is what happens if you break the deepest rules. Not because the group hated that one person specifically, because they needed everyone watching to feel it in their body, so deeply that they'd never even consider testing the boundary themselves. This is, quite possibly, the darkest truth underlying the entire invention of law. It was never purely about justice in the abstract, noble sense we like to imagine. At its core, in its earliest and rawest form, law was a tool built out of fear, the fear of chaos, the fear of endless revenge, the fear of losing control, and, in the hands of the powerful, the fear of ever being questioned. Justice, fairness, the ideals we now associate with the word law, those came later, layered on top like paint over a much older, much more brutal foundation. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you as you go about your normal week. Every rule you follow today, every law, every workplace policy, every social norm you don't even consciously think about, is sitting on top of tens of thousands of years of this exact same psychological machinery. The fear of exclusion that keeps you from breaking group norms. The relief of predictable punishment over uncertain chaos. The quiet resentment when you sense the rules don't apply equally to everyone. The reflexive hesitation before doing something wrong, even in total privacy. None of that is new. None of that is uniquely modern. You are running software that was written by starving, frightened, endlessly clever humans who figured out generation after generation, exactly what it takes to keep a group of violent, self-interested primates from destroying each other. So the next time you feel a flash of anger at something unfair, or the sting of being left out of a conversation, or the quiet relief of knowing exactly what happens if you break a rule at work, remember where that feeling actually comes from. It didn't start with a courtroom. It didn't start with a constitution. It started around a fire 40,000 years ago, with a group of frightened humans staring at one of their own, trying to decide, together, whether the rest of them were going to survive the night. We like to think we've evolved past all of that. But maybe we didn't build a new system at all. Maybe we just wrote the oldest fear humans ever had, the fear of each other, into stone, then paper, then screens, and called it civilization.